Hi, I'm Janice Switlo, and today I would like to talk to you and explain to you this concept of involuntary autism, or sometimes called temporary autism, and to first illustrate the consequences of that occurring. I want to harken back to Gustafson Lake situation, and during that siege, RCMP officers were in this state, I submit, of involuntary autism. And as I said, I will in a moment explain what I'm talking about that, but let me give you this illustration as to what occurred. They had emptied, I don't know how many shots. They ultimately killed a dog as a result of, as it turned out, the evidence showed in court, that their mirror had hit a branch while they were backing up. So it was a loud, startling snap sound. They took it as them being fired at by the people at Gustafson Lake, the Indigenous nationals there, and reacted. And as I said, I'll explain, in this state of almost involuntary autism, and started firing back. And as I said, shot the dog, and it's just kind of a miracle that no humans were killed at that moment. But it all got triggered because of a branch hitting a side mirror of their vehicle. Now you think, well, that's kind of hard to believe. Why would they respond in that way? What are you talking about? So let me fill you in on how this happens. And it's very common. And I'm referring to the book Blink by Malcolm Gladwell. And he covers, of course, it's American-based, so he's covering examples in the United States. But they're absolutely transferable to our situation here. And it says, to hear Hollywood tell it, shooting a gun is a fairly common and straightforward act. The truth is, though, that it isn't. Most police officers, well over 90%, go their whole career without ever firing at anyone. And those who do describe the experience as so unimaginably stressful that it seems reasonable to ask if firing a gun could be the kind of experience that could cause temporary autism. Now, autism, temporary autism, as he is described throughout the book, is where, in looking at how people who are autistic react, they don't see people as people per se, but as one of many objects. They do not react to the signals that most humans do when it comes to interpreting the behavior of other humans. So anyhow, he gets into a couple of descriptions by police officers who have been involved in this situation and described how things felt to them. And it says, yet in interviews with police officers who have been involved with shootings, these same details appear again and again. Extreme visual clarity, tunnel vision, diminished sound, and the sense that time is slowing down. This is how the human body reacts to extreme stress. And it makes sense. Our mind, faced with a life-threatening situation, drastically limits the range and amount of information that we have to deal with. Sound and memory and broader social understanding are sacrificed in favor of heightened awareness of the threat directly in front of us. But what happens when this stress response is taken to an extreme? And the book goes on to describe, the optimum area of stress, and comparing an athlete, for instance, optimal performance, because stress can be beneficial in that sense. But it says most of us under pressure get too aroused, and past a certain point, our bodies begin shutting down so many sources of information that we start to become useless. After a certain measure, that's heart rate, if your heart rate is after, above 145 beats per minute. This expert says, bad things begin to happen. Complex motor skills start to break down. Doing something with one hand and not the other becomes very difficult. At 175, we begin to see an absolute breakdown of cognitive processing. The forebrain shuts down, and the midbrain, the part of your brain that is the same as your dog's, all mammals have that part of the brain, reaches up and hijacks the forebrain. Have you ever tried to have a discussion with an angry or frightened human being? You can't do it. You might as well try to argue with your dog. Vision becomes even more restricted. Behavior becomes inappropriately aggressive. In an extraordinary number of cases, people who are being fired upon void their bowels because at the heightened level of threat represented by a heart rate of 175 and above, the body considers that kind of psychological control a non-essential activity. Blood is withdrawn from our outer muscle layer and concentrated in core muscle mass. The evolutionary point of that is to make the muscles as hard as possible, to turn them into a kind of armor and limit bleeding in the event of injury. But that leaves us clumsy and helpless. This is why I say everyone should practice dialing 911, because he's heard of too many situations where in an emergency, people pick up the phone and cannot perform this most basic of functions. With their heart rate soaring and their motor coordination deteriorating, they dial 411 instead of 911 because that's the only number they remember, or they forget to press send on their cell phone, or they simply cannot pick out the individual numbers at all. You must rehearse it, because only if you've rehearsed it will it be there. It says this is precisely the reason that many police departments in recent years have banned high-speed chases. It's not just because of the dangers of hitting some innocent bystander during the chase, although that's clearly part of the worry. It's also because of what happens after the chase, since pursuing a suspect at high speed is precisely the kind of activity that pushes police officers into this dangerous state of high arousal. Quote, the LA riot was started by what cops did to Rodney King at the end of the high-speed chase. The Liberty City riot in Miami in 1980 was started by what the cops did at the end of a chase. They beat a guy to death. In 1986, they had another riot in Miami based on what cops did at the end of the chase. 3 of the major race riots in the United States over the past quarter century have been caused by what cops did at the end of the chase. So what's happening to them is when they're going through the neighborhoods at very high speed, it's very frightening, it's very scary, they lose perspective, you get wrapped up in the chase. There's that old saying, a dog in the hunt doesn't stop to scratch its fleas. So if you've ever listened to a tape of an officer broadcasting in the midst of pursuit, you can hear it in the voice. They almost yell. For new officers, there's almost hysteria. I remember, it says, he's recounting his first chase, if you will. And it says, Martin says that the King beating was precisely what one would expect when 2 parties, both with soaring heartbeats and predatory cardiovascular reactions, encounter each other. Obviously, I'm concerned about the encounters that are taking place right now throughout Canada as a result of police officers, RCMP, and Ontario officers encountering Indigenous nationals who are, conveying the factual basis upon which Canada actually exists, thanks to them and their continuing ownership of land. So, and this man, I forgot to include, he says, at a key point after this chase, one of the senior officers at the scene of the arrest told the officers to back off, but they ignored him. Why? Because they didn't hear him. They had shut down. So, and then it goes on to another example in Chicago, in which police officers shot and killed a young man at the end of a chase. And unlike Rodney King, he wasn't resisting arrest. He was just sitting in his car. He was a football player from Northwestern. His name was Robert Russ. It happened the same night the cops there shot another kid, a girl, at the end of a vehicle pursuit in a case that Johnny Cochran took and won a $20 million settlement for. The cops said he was driving erratically. He led them on a chase, but it wasn't even that high speed. They never got above 70 miles per hour. After a while, they ran him off the road. They spun his car out. The instructions on vehicle stops like that are very detailed. So the cops are supposed to follow a certain protocol in such cases. You are not supposed to approach the car. You are supposed to ask the driver to get out. Well, two of the cops ran up ahead and opened the passenger side door. The other, and I'm quoting, the other asshole was on the other side yelling at Russ to open the door. But Russ just sat there. I don't know what was going through his head, but he didn't respond. So this cop smashes the left rear window of the car and fires a single shot that hits Russ in his hand and chest. The cop said that, he said, "Show me your hands, show me your hands." And he's claiming now that Russ was trying to grab his gun. I don't know if that was the case. I have to accept the cop's claim, but it's beside the point. It's still an unjustified shooting because he shouldn't have been anywhere near the car, and he shouldn't have broken the window. When we have, as I've discussed in priming, not only have Indigenous nationals been primed, but Canadians as a whole have been primed to view Indigenous nationals in the same kind of derogatory manner, less than, fully human, not as well, no need to repeat all of those rather offensive things. But the point is, how many of the current officers enforcing injunctions, etc., monitoring these blockades and things that are happening, how many of them are actually primed to view Indigenous nationals in a certain way, a Hollywood way, the cowboys and Indians, they'll scalp me, they're very dangerous kind of way. We know it exists because look at the results of the number of Indigenous nationals that are in jail as compared to non-Indigenous people when faced with the same sorts of alleged criminal activity. And there's many instances of young Indigenous men, for instance, having been killed because they've gone onto property, and the people there have held these kinds of fears and are acting in a manner such as police officers often will. And we're in new ground in many cases. There's a lot of tension out there. There's a lot of fear, and so an extreme excitement of this chase. In this particular case, he says he stopped reading his mind. His vision and his thinking narrowed. He constructed a rigid system that said that a young black man in a car running from the police had to be a dangerous criminal. And all evidence to the contrary that would ordinarily have been factored into his thinking, the fact that Russ was just sitting in his car and that he had never gone above 70 miles per hour, did not register at all. Arousal leaves us mind blind. So we have a very precarious situation, not because of the activities or actions of Indigenous nationals per se, but because of how easily police officers, enforcers, can be triggered into this state of temporary autism, where they do not, and you couple that with being primed in Canada's legal system based on the doctrine of discovery, that this is beasts of the field, these are not really fully human beings, that's just a recipe for disaster. So even though the Indigenous nationals are conducting themselves in a very peaceful manner, it doesn't take much, as we saw at Gustafson Lake, for instance, for them to be triggered and start shooting. I mean, when I visited that site, I was absolutely shocked. I mean, I saw, the few hunting rifles that were there so they could feed themselves. And often, too, during ceremony, you can't just serve food bought at Safeway. Part of the ceremony is the gifts from the Creator in the form of animals upon which to feed. As part of the feasting and such that takes place in terms of the context of the ceremony. So it's not unexpected for them to have a couple of those there. But when I went there and I saw what the police did, all of the trees, a whole line, all of the trees at this level on me, so about 5 feet or so, head level, they were completely cut down. Not by axes, they were cut down by bullets. And these people at Gustafson Lake, who I became close to as they asked me to assist them after, by bringing this whole thing to an end, and asked me to assist them because they knew that it was only a matter of time before they would be killed, right? They credit their strong faith in the protection of Creator, that no one did, no one was killed, only one person was injured in an arm. But when I looked at that, I couldn't move for a while to see all of those trees cut down by fire, by bullets. I mean, you think back to Predator movie, when they're firing in the bush because they've seen movement and they're just gonna blast away and try to get the predator. That was nothing. Imagine that whole scene where everything is leveled. How long it takes to do that. Just terribly, terribly disturbing. But thanks to kind of reading this sort of information, it explains better how easy that people can be triggered to do such things. They didn't see human beings beneath those trees, covering their heads, being hit on the head by the spent bullets and stuff. They didn't see people. They were just engaged in this hyper stressed state where they needed to do what they were doing. There was no hearing, there was no seeing, there was no feeling. So this is what worries me intensely about our situation in Canada today. How easy it can end in tragedy. How unnecessary for the escalations to be happening. When people were seeing, even the releases of the earlier blockade that was taken down in the Wet'suwet'en area, when we heard about the green light, well, again at Gustafson, there was a green light, shoot to kill. These things are all too often and all too easily can end in absolute tragic circumstances, and this is not good for Canada's legacy in any way, shape, or form. Isn't it better to start building upon the actual foundation of two nation-to-nation, Crown, head of state for Canada, and Indigenous nations who granted permissions, and between whom treaties exist? Isn't it better to get on with that work instead of having all these people, including, friendly fire, let's not forget that. People get hurt. Is that what happened at Oka? Horrible situation to bring up, but this is my concern as I continue to monitor the events going on in Canada, and that's all I have to say.